What team opposition recognizes as a base principle is that breaking up is hard to do. And that's why we're going to say that yes, there may be arbitrary lines. Yes, history is sad. My history is kind of sad as well. Point is, it's not the propositions mechanism that's going to fix it. Our position today is that statehood is not a fundamental right of people in all regions. States exist instrumentally to protect other rights of populations, and this explains why the international community has to recognize a state for it to be legitimate, a criteria conceded in their own case. It's something we don't automatically assume, such as, for instance, your right to life. Thus, we think that secession, but in particular secession, should only be granted when a new state can best protect the rights of its people. This doesn't come with the unilateral secession they're talking about. It only comes when a majority of people in both the parent state and the region in question agree that it's a good thing. We agree we want to protect minorities too, but secession is not the best way to do it. In fact, we suggest a toolbox of alternatives that we can keep coming back to. Things like more regional autonomy with the approval of a parent state. Things like approving regions campaigning peacefully with parent states for independence. They said devolution has a cost, but we are going to show you in our substantive arguments that the costs of unilateral secession are far greater and far more dangerous. And what's a successful example of our case? What happened in the post-1989 region in the Baltic states, where Boris Yeltsin of Russia and the heads of the Baltic states approved their secession and cooperatively decided to declare an end to the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The burden on side proposition, hold on, listen to this first. Proposition must show that in a significant majority of cases, unilateral secession benefits people in the region in question. We'll prove this through three positive arguments. First, why this minimizes conflict. Second, how we don't create nations that are doomed to fail. And lastly, my second speaker is going to argue that their case encourages further abuse of minorities. Before we move on, let's look at two questions with regard to their case. First, is their model effective? Second, does it benefit people? Under which I'm going to tackle both their substantive arguments about arbitrary lines being drawn and the need for full autonomy. So let's look first at their model. And here they presented a set of criteria which we're going to rebut individually. They talked about permanent populations for a significant number, for a significant amount of time. We're going to contest this because we think that parent states don't want these regions to secede. What they're going to do in practice is constantly evict these minorities and disperse them to other regions in the country. So systemically speaking, you're never going to have these people in a particular region, no thank you, at a particular point in time. My second speaker is going to further this in his argument. Then he talked about ability to sustain international relations. We pointed out the point of information that China is unlikely to be able to do this with Tibet, and neither is Russia with regard to breakaway regions like Chechnya. All they said was, well, maybe there'll be better democratic relations between these states. Excuse me, not every state in the world is democratic. We're quite clear what China is going to do to Tibet after it gassed and killed lots of people just because of some protests. We want to disagree.
Yeah, okay. So listen, Tibet then, being an independent country, means that it can garner support from the rest of the international community, means that the border that China is now crossing is an international one, and helps to garner support in that sense.
The Dalai Lama has garnered lots of international support for Tibet thus far. Have we seen a defense of the Tibetan population? Have we seen China stop its effectiveness of its military forces? No, that's our answer to you. Moving back to our case, on the last issue of economic viability, we say we're going to deal with this in our second argument, but suffice to say that parent nations are going to be able to cut off important resources and trade links to secessionist regions, and that's going to mean systemically, no thank you, that they're not going to be viable at all. So let's now look at benefits. And here, they give us at the start an example, no thank you, of South Sudan. Let's point out that what happened was, North Sudan immediately attacked South Sudan after it broke away, seized most of its oil resources, and has left it in a state of conflict and chaos. How is that any better under your model? Then he talked about grievances being aired, but he never explained why grievances being aired necessitated unilateral secession. We challenge the next speaker to explain this. In fact, we think it's going to be a lot easier for governments to garner support for invasions now that the people in these regions are no longer seen as part of our society, but as enemies, as foreigners. In fact, we question them. How is their new state in any region ever going to be protected? They never explain this in their model. If they are not going to be protected, we question whether any genuine autonomy is going to be achieved. So those are my two areas of rebuttal clear. Let's now talk about this issue of minimizing conflict, my first argument. Our thesis is that unilateral secession antagonizes the parent state, precipitating conflict and harming lives. Now, if secession occurs, no thank you, without the approval of the majority in a parent state is likely to feel very alienated. Why? Because people often attach strong national pride to the territory they hold. Secession, unilaterally, is seen as a provocative step that insults the dignity of the rest of the population. What then happens? Nationalistic sentiment is easily fanned, no thank you, by populist politicians. There's a desire for revenge that often translates into a desire for an attack on a new state. And if the new state is attacked by the parent state, it's likely to suffer very badly. We've seen this in the 1970s, when the Tamils tried to secede unilaterally from Sri Lanka. The Sinhalese military essentially attacked them and ground them to a halt until in 2009, the Tamil Tigers were completely exterminated. We saw this also in the very painful breakup of Aceh when they tried to secede unilaterally in the 1960s, when they were wiped out by the Indonesian military. Now, even if it might be possible for the UN or an international community to come in and provide aid, we don't think it's going to work for two reasons. First of all, because of diplomatic moves to stop the aid being provided. We talked about Russia and China and their veto powers. And secondly, conflict's going to be stoked within the independent region. Before I move on, yes?
Because that's happened elsewhere, do you think that's definitely going to happen if Scotland breaks away from England?
There's a reason why Scotland decided to build a nice devolved parliament, because it knows that secession is going to be more costly. So the example is ready for us. That's why we're standing here. That's why we're standing with Dundee City Council supporting this tournament. In fact, we often seceded due to oppression. A lot of people often secede due to oppression, but the grievance is likely to mean reprisals against members of the same ethnic group or religion as the parent state. We saw this in India and Pakistan, where there was a bloodbath on both sides when they separated in 1947. Dismembered body parts, no thank you, getting sent over across both borders with dismembered breasts, dismembered body parts. Think of the horror. Ladies and gentlemen, conflict's likely to be worse since governments of the parent state are going to be feeling increasingly legitimate in attacking the new state because it's now seen as an enemy, as I explained just now. If we don't allow such unilateral secession, majorities can agree in parent states and the regions in question, reduce probability of attack occurs, and there's law enforcement on both sides, which helps to prevent conflict. So that's why we stop conflict. Let's now talk about creating nations that are doomed to fail. Here, we say that unilateral secession often creates nations that are economically unviable. Why? Because they're often too small and parent states control significant strategic resources like water and trade routes, and often they lack economic hinterlands, preventing them from developing economies of scale designed for them to grow well enough. We've seen this in Palestine and Israel, where Israel controls all the key trade routes and access to fresh water, and in fact sunders the Palestinian state in two. East Timor, Indonesia cut trade links after they decided to declare independence. There was a civil war until 2009. The economy is still considered so small that ASEAN, an economic community that isn't very successful, doesn't even want East Timor as part of it. That's why we demonstrated that on grounds of economic viability and saving lives, it's our side that truly protects our past and our present and our future.